When my own brother looked me dead in the eye and handed my hard-earned promotion to his entirely unqualified wife, I did not scream. I did not throw things. I simply smiled, got in my car, and drove home. He thought he had put me in my place. He had absolutely no idea that in exactly 4 days, the multi-million-dollar logistics empire he claimed to run would crumble to the ground, leaving him weeping and leaving exactly 132 desperate missed calls on my private cell phone. If you have ever poured your blood and sweat into a family business only to be treated like the help, keep listening. You are going to want to hear exactly how I made them pay. The air conditioning in the 40th floor boardroom of Legacy Logistics always ran too cold, but today it felt like ice against my skin. I sat across the sprawling mahogany table from Terrence, my older brother, and the chief executive officer of our family company. Atlanta stretched out beneath us through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a bustling hub of commerce and transportation. For the past 5 years, I had been the engine keeping this company alive. As the director of supply chain and data, I was the one who crawled into the trenches when routes failed, when drivers quit, and when our aging infrastructure threatened to buckle under the weight of modern demands. I was 32 years old, running on 4 hours of sleep, and I was finally ready to claim what was mine. I slid the heavy leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood. The quarterly report was my masterpiece. I watched Terrence pick it up, his manicured fingers flipping casually through the pages. The numbers were undeniable. A 40% increase in third-quarter profits. A complete reduction in deadhead miles for our trucking fleet. 2 massive national grocery contracts secured entirely because of the proprietary routing protocols I had instituted. I had given up my weekends, my holidays, and my personal life to ensure Legacy Logistics did not just survive but dominated the southeastern corridor. This was supposed to be my moment. The vice president of operations role had been vacant for 6 months, and my parents had heavily implied that my sweat equity would be rewarded. I waited for Terrence to look up to acknowledge the undeniable fact that I had just saved the company from a disastrous fiscal year. Instead, he closed the folder with a soft thud and pushed it back across the table toward me. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. "Sydney, these numbers are solid." He began using that practiced corporate voice he usually reserved for difficult vendors. "You have done a lot of heavy lifting lately. The dispatchers like you. The warehouse guys respect you. You are a real workhorse for this family." I felt a slight tightening in my chest at the word workhorse. It was the same word my father used to describe me. In our family, Terrence was the visionary, the golden child born to wear the crown, while I was simply the tool expected to keep the gears turning. But I pushed the resentment down, maintaining my professional posture. "Thank you, Terrence," I said evenly. "As you can see from the projections, if we implement my new data tracking system company-wide, we can reduce operational waste by another 20% by the fourth quarter. I am ready to roll this out as the new vice president of operations." Terrence sighed, a theatrical sound meant to convey the heavy burden of leadership. He folded his hands on the table. "Look, Sydney, you work hard. Nobody is denying your grit. But the vice president role requires more than just crunching numbers and yelling at truck drivers. It requires a certain executive presence. It requires someone who can mingle with the upper echelon of corporate clients, someone who understands the nuances of high-level networking and optics. You are great in the background, but you just do not have the polish we need for the face of operations." The words hung in the cold boardroom air, heavy and suffocating. Executive presence. Polish. I stared at my brother, the man who had spent the last 3 weeks playing golf at the country club, while I personally drove to our distribution center at 2 in the morning to fix a collapsed loading dock. He was telling me that my undeniable results, my brilliant strategy, and my literal sweat were not enough because I did not fit his superficial, carefully curated image of a corporate executive. I was a black woman who built the foundation he was currently standing on, yet I was being told to stay in the basement. I kept my face perfectly neutral, though a roaring fire was igniting in my veins. "If my 40% profit increase does not qualify as executive presence," I asked quietly, "then who exactly did you find that meets these rigorous qualifications?" "Right on cue." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The click of designer heels echoed against the hardwood floor. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Julianne walked in, bringing with her an overwhelming cloud of expensive floral perfume. She was Terrence's wife of 2 years, a 31-year-old white woman whose entire professional background consisted of a brief stint as a lifestyle blogger and running a failed boutique candle shop. Julianne moved to stand behind Terrence, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder. She was wearing a pristine white Chanel suit. A suit I recognized immediately because I was the one who approved the corporate credit card expense report last week under the guise of public relations wardrobe. "Hey there, Sydney," Julianne said, flashing a bright, entirely vacant smile. "I hope I am not interrupting the performance review." "Actually, your timing is perfect," Terrence said, looking up at his wife with genuine admiration. "Sydney, I want to formally introduce you to our new Vice President of Operations. Julianne has exactly the kind of modern, elevated vision this company needs to attract top-tier investors. She understands the aesthetic of success." I looked from my brother to his wife. The sheer audacity of the insult temporarily robbed me of breath. They were handing a multi-million-dollar logistics division, a complex web of trucks, warehouses, and data systems, to a woman whose greatest logistical achievement was coordinating the catering for her own baby shower. It was a slap in the face so profound, so deliberately disrespectful, that the anger inside me suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It turned into absolute, razor-sharp clarity. Julianne walked around the table and leaned over my chair. She smelled like privilege and unearned confidence. She patted my shoulder in a gesture so patronizing it made my skin crawl. "Thank you so much for keeping the seat warm, sweetie," Julianne said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Terrence has told me all about how hard you work in the background. I know logistics can be so dreary and technical, but do not worry. I am going to bring a fresh, vibrant energy to the department. I am thinking we should redesign the driver uniforms first. Oh, and I am going to need you to train me on that complicated dispatch software you use. We should probably schedule a sit-down on Friday, so you can walk me through all the administrative passwords and daily tasks. I know we are going to be such a fantastic team." She stood there beaming, waiting for me to nod, waiting for me to accept my role as the loyal, invisible mule who would do all the actual work, while she paraded around with the title, the salary, and the Chanel suits. Terrence watched me, a smug, satisfied expression on his face, entirely certain that I would swallow my pride for the sake of the family business, just like I always did. But they had miscalculated. They had severely underestimated the woman they had spent years pushing to the side. I looked down at the quarterly report, the physical proof of my brilliance that they had just discarded. Then I looked up at Julianne's flawless, expecting face. I did not yell. I did not justify my worth. I reached out slowly and deliberately closed my laptop and placed it inside my leather tote bag. I stood up, smoothing the front of my own blazer. I looked Terrence right in the eyes, matching his confident posture with a dead, hollow stare. Then I turned to Julianne and offered her a bright, terrifyingly calm smile. "Congratulations on the new role, Julianne," I said smoothly. "I am sure your uniform redesign will be groundbreaking. However, you will have to figure out the dispatch software on your own." I quit. I turned on my heel and walked toward the glass doors. The sudden silence in the boardroom was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. The game had completely changed, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. The heavy steel doors of the executive elevator were inches from sliding shut when a hand in a custom-tailored suit shoved its way between the panels. The safety sensors beeped a sharp warning. The doors jerked backward and slid open to reveal Terrence. His chest was heaving. The cool and arrogant demeanor he had just paraded in the boardroom was completely gone. It was replaced by a frantic and ugly shade of panic disguised as rage. He stepped into the confined space and backed me toward the mirrored rear wall. He hit the emergency stop button. The elevator lurched to a halt between the 39th and 40th floors. "You think you can just walk out?" He snarled, his voice echoing off the metallic walls. "You think you can throw a childish tantrum and leave my wife hanging on her first week?" "It is not a tantrum, Terrence," I said calmly. "It is a resignation." He stepped closer. He invaded my personal space and tried to use his height to intimidate me. I will ruin you, Sydney. Do you hear me? I am the Chief Executive Officer of Legacy Logistics. I sit on the board of the Atlanta Supply Chain Coalition. I play golf with the regional directors of every major freight network from here to Savannah. I control the narrative in this town. If you walk out of this building without handing over those administrative passwords and spending the next 2 weeks training Julianne, I will personally ensure you never work in the logistics industry in this city ever again. I will make sure every headhunter and recruiter throws your resume in the trash. I watched a bead of sweat form at his temple and slowly trace a path down his jawline. He was projecting power and puffing out his chest in his custom suit, but I could smell the absolute terror radiating off him. He knew exactly how much of the company daily operations relied on the systems I had built from scratch. He knew that without me, the warehouse floor would descend into chaos within hours. When the professional threats did not make me flinch, he pivoted to the one weapon our family always used when they wanted to force me into submission: the ultimate trump card. "Dad is going to crush you for this," Terrence hissed, lowering his voice into a vicious and ragged whisper. Desmond built this empire from a single delivery truck in 1985. He bled for this legacy. He built it for us and for the family, so we would not have to scrape by like he did. And you are going to spit on his life work because you are jealous of your sister-in-law, because you did not get a fancy title. Dad will completely erase you. He will cut you out of the trust and the properties and the family history. You will be a complete disgrace to this family named Sydney. You will have nothing. I looked at the emergency stop button glowing a harsh neon red between us. Then I looked at my brother, the golden child, the heir apparent who could not even read a routing manifest without calling my extension for help. The man who had just handed my 5 years of sacrifice to a woman whose greatest professional achievement was picking out office furniture. "Are you quite finished?" I asked. My voice did not shake. It was smooth and steady and dangerously quiet. It was the voice of a woman who had stopped caring about the approval of men who would only ever see her as a stepping stone. Terrence blinked. He was clearly thrown by my lack of emotional response. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the dutiful daughter to apologize and internalize the guilt, and fall back into line, just like our parents had conditioned me to do since childhood. "Pull the emergency button, Terrence," I said, my gaze cutting right through his facade. "I have a lot of things to do today, and coddling your insecurities is no longer on my schedule." He stared at me for a long and heavy moment. His jaw worked furiously, but he had run out of ammunition. His hand shot out and slapped the button. The elevator jerked back to life, dropping my stomach slightly as it began its rapid descent to the executive parking garage. The ride down was utterly silent. The tension in the small space was thick enough to choke on. When the doors finally parted to reveal the dimly lit concrete expanse of the underground garage, I did not wait for him to move. I walked straight toward my reserved parking spot. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement, creating a steady and unbothered cadence that echoed through the cavernous space. Terrence followed me. His dress shoes slapped the concrete in a desperate and uneven rhythm. "I am not joking, Sydney," he called out to my back, his voice bouncing off the concrete pillars. "You have until the end of the business day to send Julianne those login credentials. If you do not do this, do not bother asking Dad for forgiveness. He will lock you out of this family forever." I reached my car. I opened the heavy driver's side door and tossed my leather tote bag onto the passenger seat. I turned to face him one last time. He stood a few feet away, panting slightly with his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "Terrence," I said, my tone eerily conversational and lacking any of the heat he was desperately trying to provoke. "You and Julianne are about to learn a very hard and very expensive lesson about what actually runs this company. I highly recommend you spend the rest of the afternoon reviewing your vendor contracts instead of standing in a parking garage threatening me." I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The heavy metallic clunk of the electronic locks engaging echoed loudly in the quiet garage. It placed a physical barrier between my past and my future. I started the engine and shifted into drive and pulled smoothly out of my designated spot. As I drove toward the exit ramp, I glanced in my rearview mirror. My brother was standing completely alone in the exhaust fumes, staring after my taillights with a look of dawning and uncomfortable confusion. I navigated up the spiraling ramps of the garage and merged onto the bustling Atlanta streets. The afternoon sun was blinding and provided a sharp, brilliant contrast to the artificial chill of the corporate office I had just permanently abandoned. I drove for about 15 minutes. The adrenaline finally began to course through my veins, making my fingertips tingle against the leather steering wheel. I did not head toward my apartment. Instead, I pulled into the empty parking lot of a small and quiet coffee shop on the edge of the city limits. I put the car in park and took a deep and cleansing breath. The air tasted like absolute freedom, but my work was not quite done. I reached into my bag and pulled out my personal cell phone. I bypassed my normal business contacts and opened a secure encrypted messaging application I rarely used. I tapped on a contact simply labeled Architect. This was my private IT contractor. He was the brilliant freelance developer I had personally hired and paid out of my own pocket 3 years ago to build the proprietary routing software Legacy Logistics was currently running on. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing out the single and decisive command that would change the trajectory of my family's entire existence. Initiate Protocol 0. Revoke all Legacy Logistics access to the Apex routing system at exactly 11:59 tonight. Lock all administrative portals. I hit send. A green checkmark appeared instantly on the screen, confirming the message was delivered and read. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. I put the car back into drive and merged back into the traffic, leaving the wreckage of their arrogance far behind me. The clatter of heavy sterling silver against fine china echoed through the massive dining room of my parents' estate in Buckhead. I had barely taken my seat next to my grandmother when my mother Vivian slammed her fork down hard enough to make the crystal water glasses vibrate. Her eyes were narrowed into sharp slits of pure disappointment. "How dare you abandon your brother?" Her voice sliced through the smell of roasted turkey and candied yams. "Black businesses are under attack every single day in this country, and you are acting like a jealous child over a meaningless title." I did not flinch. I slowly unrolled my linen napkin and placed it on my lap. The early Thanksgiving dinner had been a tradition in our family for decades, but tonight, the sprawling mahogany table felt like a tribunal. I was only here for my grandmother Pearl, who sat quietly beside me with her frail hands folded in her lap. Her health had been declining rapidly over the last few months, and I refused to let my parents' petty corporate drama rob me of what might be my last holiday meal with her. But Vivian was not interested in family harmony. She was interested in obedience. "You are incredibly selfish, Sydney." My mother continued, leaning forward so the diamond necklace my father bought her with company profits caught the light. "Terrence is carrying the weight of your father's legacy on his shoulders. He is ensuring that this family retains its power and influence in Atlanta. You know how hard it is for a black man to maintain an empire in the logistics industry. Instead of standing behind him and supporting the blood that runs in your veins, you throw a tantrum and walk out, leaving him completely stranded." I picked up my water glass and took a slow, measured sip. It was fascinating to watch my mother weaponize our racial heritage to justify my subjugation. She was completely ignoring the fact that the person who had actually kept that black business running was the black woman sitting right in front of her. Terrence sat at the opposite end of the table, carving his turkey with an air of relaxed arrogance. He did not even have the courage to look me in the eye. I was letting our mother fight his battles just like he let me do his work. "Your mother is right, Sydney." My father Desmond finally spoke up from the head of the table. His voice held that deep, booming resonance he used to intimidate warehouse managers and unruly contractors. He pointed his steak knife in my direction. "You have let your pride cloud your professional judgment. We gave you an incredible opportunity at Legacy Logistics. We let you build the data department. We trusted you with the operational infrastructure. But you lack the overarching vision required for executive leadership. You focus too much on the minor technical details." Minor technical details. That was what my father called the proprietary routing software I had personally funded and built. The software that saved his failing company from bankruptcy 3 years ago. I maintained my blank expression, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. Julianne brings a fresh corporate perspective to the table. Desmond continued, wiping his mouth with a napkin. She understands modern business aesthetics. She knows how to talk to the stakeholders we need to attract if we are going to expand into the northern markets. You are too rigid, Sydney. You do not have the soft skills required to be the face of this company. We need someone who can navigate those high-level spaces with grace. I looked over at Julianne. She was sitting next to Terrence wearing a beige cashmere sweater that cost more than most of our drivers made in a month. She was quietly sipping her wine, watching the entire exchange with a faint look of amusement playing on her lips. She was thoroughly enjoying watching my own family tear me down to elevate her. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. My parents were lecturing me about Black excellence and family loyalty, while simultaneously handing the keys to our generational wealth over to an unqualified white woman, simply because she looked the part of a traditional corporate executive. Julianne set her wine glass down and offered me a patronizing smile. "I know this transition has been hard for you, Sydney," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Change is always difficult, especially when you have been stuck in the same routine for so long. Terrence and I were talking on the drive over here, and we actually feel terrible about how you reacted this afternoon. We know you are probably just feeling a little lost and overwhelmed without a husband or a family of your own to focus on. It is perfectly natural for single women to become overly attached to their job titles." The sheer audacity of her microaggression hung in the air. She was weaponizing my single status to invalidate my professional ambition. My grandmother Pearl reached out under the table and gently squeezed my knee. It was a silent plea for me to keep my temper in check. I patted her frail hand reassuringly. I did not need to raise my voice. The trap they were walking into was already set, and their arrogance was the final lock clicking into place. "I am perfectly fine, Julianne," I replied, keeping my tone exceptionally polite and pleasant. "But I do appreciate your deep concern for my personal life. I am sure your vast experience in lifestyle blogging will translate seamlessly to managing a fleet of 400 commercial freight trucks." Terrence slammed his hand on the table. "Watch your mouth, Sydney." He snapped, his previous relaxed demeanor vanishing instantly. "You are not the smartest person in the room just because you know how to write some code and balance a spreadsheet. Julianne is trying to help you. We are all trying to help you save yourself from making a massive mistake. You walked out on us today, but we are willing to be the bigger people here." Julianne reached down beside her chair and pulled a sleek leather designer folder from her handbag. She unzipped it and slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the table. It stopped right next to my dinner plate. The document had the Legacy Logistics corporate letterhead printed clearly on the top page. "I convinced Terrence to be generous." Julianne set her eyes locking onto mine with a cold and calculating gleam. "We know you do not have any other prospects right now, and nobody in the Atlanta supply chain industry is going to hire an executive who walks out on her own family without notice. We are offering you a lifeline. If you sign this consulting contract right now, we will let you come back to the office on Monday." I looked down at the document without touching it. "And what exactly does this lifeline entail?" I asked softly. "It is an independent contractor agreement," Desmond explained from the head of the table, folding his arms across his chest. "You will return to the office to train Julianne on the dispatch software and the routing protocols. You will assist her in managing the daily operational fires until she feels comfortable taking over completely. You will be paid an hourly consulting rate at minimum wage, no benefits and no end-of-year bonus." I stared at my father. He was looking at me without a single ounce of paternal affection. He was treating me like a rogue employee who needed to be broken and brought to heel. They wanted me to train my own replacement for pennies on the dollar, all while allowing Julianne to take the credit and the massive vice president salary. "And if I decline this generous offer?" I asked, looking back at Julianne. Julianne smiled, her lips pulling back to reveal perfectly white teeth. "If you sign this consulting contract to help me for the next 6 months at minimum wage, we will not tell Dad to cut you from the will. Terrence and I have already discussed it with him. If you do not sign it, Desmond is going to call his estate lawyers on Monday morning. You will be completely removed from the family trust. You will lose your share of the properties, the investments, and the company dividends. You will literally walk away with nothing." The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. My mother looked down at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes. My father sat tall and rigid, waiting for me to submit to his absolute authority. Terrence was smirking, finally feeling like the powerful chief executive he so desperately pretended to be. They had laid out their ultimate threat. They believed my entire future depended on their financial grace and their corporate approval. They thought they had backed me into a corner from which there was absolutely no escape. They had no idea that I was already holding the match that would burn their entire kingdom to ash. The morning sun in Miami felt incredibly warm against my skin, a sharp and beautiful contrast to the sterile, chilled air of the corporate boardroom I had left behind in Atlanta. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my luxury beachfront rental, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves below. I held a cup of black coffee in one hand and my company-issued cell phone in the other. The screen of the device was completely dark. I had powered it down the moment my flight landed the night before. I walked back inside the spacious living room and dropped the dead phone into the bottom drawer of a heavy oak dresser, pushing it shut with a satisfying thud. I was completely disconnected from their world, and it was the most liberating feeling I had experienced in 5 long years. I carried my coffee back out to the balcony and took a seat at the circular glass table. I opened my personal laptop and booted up the operating system. I bypassed my normal email applications and opened a private secured web browser, navigating directly to the administrative dashboard of Apex Data Solutions. This was the central nervous system of the software I had built with my own money. The interface loaded instantly, displaying a sleek dark background illuminated by flowing streams of green and red data logs. I took a slow sip of my coffee and reviewed the automated alerts that had pinged my system over the last 36 hours. The timeline of their panic was laid out before me in perfect chronological order. At exactly 1 minute to midnight on Thanksgiving, Protocol 0 had executed flawlessly. The red text on my screen confirmed that every single terminal, tablet, and mobile dispatch unit at Legacy Logistics had been completely severed from the Apex routing system. The initial wave of chaos started around 4 in the morning on day 1. I watched the login attempts multiplying rapidly on my screen. The early morning dispatchers had arrived at the Atlanta warehouse expecting to print their daily manifests. Instead, they were greeted by blank screens displaying a simple "access denied" notification. I watched as the floor managers desperately tried to bypass the security wall using their outdated supervisor credentials. Denied. 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 The red error codes cascaded down my screen like digital rain. By 7 in the morning on day 1, the panic had clearly reached the executive level. My dashboard registered a frantic series of login attempts using the credentials belonging to Terrence. He was trying to access the master administrative portal from his home office IP address. He tried his primary password, then his backup password, and finally he tried to force a system reset. Every single attempt bounced harmlessly off the impenetrable firewall I had established. I sat there on my balcony, feeling the gentle ocean breeze, and imagined my brother pacing around his mansion, sweating through his expensive morning clothes, as he realized his multi-million-dollar operation was completely paralyzed. The real disaster, however, did not happen until the morning of day 2. I was sitting on a plush white sofa in the rental living room, enjoying a plate of fresh fruit, when my monitoring software emitted a soft chime. I set my fork down and pulled the laptop onto my lap. The live monitoring feed showed that someone was attempting to access the core database using the brand new vice president credentials. Julianne had finally arrived at the office to play the role of the visionary corporate leader. I watched the keystroke logs register her frantic and clumsy attempts to navigate a system she fundamentally did not understand. Instead of admitting she was out of her depth, Julianne decided to prove her executive presence. She found an old, obsolete backdoor portal I had intentionally left buried in the legacy company intranet years ago. It was a honeypot trap designed to catch unauthorized users trying to manipulate the shipping zones. My screen lit up with a massive yellow warning banner. Julianne was attempting to brute force a master reset of the daily routing matrix. She had absolutely no idea that bypassing the safety protocols would trigger a hard system purge. I leaned back into the soft cushions and watched the inevitable catastrophe unfold in real time. She clicked the final execution command. The system immediately registered a critical error. In a matter of seconds, Julianne accidentally deleted the active routing schedules for 60 commercial delivery trucks. I stared at the dashboard as the magnitude of her incompetence materialized in the data. Those 60 trucks represented thousands of pallets of high-value freight. They were carrying perishable goods, sensitive medical supplies, and strict deadline retail inventory. Without the routing matrix, the trucks were completely blind. The drivers had no destination coordinates, no delivery sequence codes, and no gate access clearances. The entire fleet was effectively anchored to the concrete of the loading docks. The financial bleed was instantaneous and catastrophic. They were losing thousands of dollars every single minute those trucks sat idle. The woman Terrence chose to elevate, because she looked the part, had just driven a stake straight through the financial heart of his company. I closed the dashboard and opened my secure encrypted messaging application. I had exactly one ally left inside the corporate office. My former assistant Renee was a brilliant and observant young black woman who knew exactly how toxic my family could be. She had promised to keep me updated on the fallout, and she did not disappoint. A long message from Renee popped onto my screen. The text confirmed everything I had just seen in the data logs and painted a vivid picture of the absolute meltdown happening back in Atlanta. Renee described how the warehouse floor had descended into a total riot. The union drivers were screaming at the shift supervisors because they were losing their daily mileage pay. The facility managers were threatening to walk off the job because they had no way to process incoming shipments. The loading bays were a massive parking lot of stalled 18-wheelers. I read the next part of the message, and a cold smile touched my lips. According to Renee, Julianne was currently locked inside the executive washroom on the 40th floor. The new vice president of operations was sitting on the bathroom floor crying hysterically because she realized she had just wiped out the entire regional delivery schedule. She had locked the door and was refusing to come out and speak to the furious warehouse managers who were demanding answers. The final update from Renee was the piece of information I had been waiting for. The panic had pushed Terrence past the point of rational thought. Instead of trying to contact me and negotiate a surrender, my brother was letting his arrogance guide his business strategy. Renee informed me that Terrence was currently pacing around the boardroom screaming into his phone. He had just authorized a massive emergency payment to an outside commercial cybersecurity firm. He was officially hiring third-party hackers to forcefully break into my Apex software servers to retrieve the stolen data. I locked the screen of my laptop and set it on the glass table. The ocean waves continued to crash against the Miami shoreline, providing a steady and peaceful rhythm to my morning. Terrence thought he could use brute force to break down a wall he did not even own. He was walking blindly into a legal trap so devastating it would strip him of everything he valued. I picked up my glass of fresh orange juice and took a long, slow sip. The bridge was burning beautifully, and I was completely ready for day 3. The automated security protocol on my secondary monitor flashed a brilliant crimson. A high-pitched digital alarm pierced the quiet atmosphere of my Miami beachfront rental. I set down my glass of fresh orange juice and leaned closer to the high-definition screen. The dashboard of Apex Data Solutions was currently lighting up like a Christmas tree. Someone was aggressively trying to tunnel into my proprietary servers, and they were doing a remarkably sloppy job of it. I opened the Firewall Diagnostic tab and watched the incoming traffic patterns. Terrence had actually done it. He had taken his desperation to the absolute limit. Rather than picking up the phone and attempting to negotiate with the sister he had just publicly humiliated, he had authorized a commercial cybersecurity firm to conduct an unauthorized penetration test against a closed network. The incoming Internet Protocol addresses traced back to a mid-tier technology consulting group located in downtown Atlanta. They were attempting to use standard brute force decryption software to bypass the administrative lock I had placed on the legacy logistics terminal network. It was almost embarrassing to watch. My private developer had built this system using military-grade encryption standards. The hackers Terrence hired were trying to pick a bank vault lock with a rusty paperclip. I sat back against the plush white cushions of the rental sofa and watched the defensive algorithms of my software effortlessly swat away their intrusion attempts. Every single time their software tried to ping the master database, my security protocols isolated their signal, logged their digital footprint, and bounced them into a harmless feedback loop. But what Terrence did not understand was that he had just handed me the ultimate weapon. He had crossed the line from a simple internal family dispute into the realm of federal cybercrime. I tapped my fingers against the glass surface of the coffee table. My mind briefly drifted back to a specific afternoon exactly 3 years ago. The memory tasted like ash, but it fueled the deep satisfaction I was currently experiencing. I had walked into my father Desmond's office holding a comprehensive operational proposal. I had spent 2 months researching and designing a blueprint to modernize the entire routing infrastructure of legacy logistics. The outdated manual dispatch methods were bleeding cash, and my proposal required an initial investment of $200,000 to build a custom software solution. Terrence had been sitting on the leather sofa in our father office drinking an espresso. When I presented the financial projections and the development budget, Terrence had literally laughed out loud. He tossed my printed proposal onto the coffee table without even reading the executive summary. He told our father that spending $200,000 on invisible computer magic was a waste of capital. Logistics is about moving heavy things on expensive trucks, he had said, his tone dripping with condescension. We do not need to blow our profit margins, so my little sister can play with fancy tech gadgets. If the dispatchers are slow, tell them to work faster. Desmond had agreed with him immediately. My father always deferred to the golden child. He told me to stop trying to reinvent the wheel and to get back to my desk. They sent me away feeling entirely dismissed and utterly undervalued. But I did not give up on the idea. I knew the industry was modernizing, and without a digital backbone, the company would eventually collapse under its own weight. So I took a massive personal risk. I liquidated my entire investment portfolio and emptied my personal savings accounts. I formed an anonymous limited liability company called Apex Data Solutions. I hired a brilliant independent developer, and over the next 8 months we built the routing matrix in total secrecy. When the software was ready, I introduced it to the legacy logistics dispatch floor as a free trial from a third-party vendor. I drafted a very specific user license agreement. I brought the towering stack of administrative paperwork to Terrence for his signature. Just as I had anticipated, my brother was far too busy planning a corporate golf retreat to actually read the fine print. He signed his name on the dotted line without glancing at the terms of service. That single signature legally acknowledged that Legacy Logistics did not own the software they were using. They were operating entirely on a revocable free license granted by Apex Data Solutions. A license that specifically stated the owner could terminate access at any time without prior notice. If the primary administrative liaison, meaning myself, was no longer employed by the licensee, my brother had literally signed away the keys to his own kingdom because he was too arrogant to read a document handed to him by a black woman he considered beneath his intelligence level. The flashing red alerts on my screen brought me back to the present moment. The hacking attempts were increasing in frequency. Terrence was obviously standing over the shoulders of the consulting firm, screaming at them to break through my security walls. I took a screenshot of the incoming attack vectors and downloaded the complete digital intrusion log. I compiled the evidence into a secure zip file and attached it to an urgent email. I addressed the message to Elias, my personal corporate attorney. Elias was a brilliant and utterly ruthless litigator who specialized in intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. I had kept him on a substantial retainer for the past 2 years, specifically preparing for the day my family would force my hand. I typed out a brief and highly specific set of instructions. Elias, please review the attached server logs. Legacy Logistics has contracted a third-party entity to conduct an unauthorized and aggressive breach of the Apex Data Solutions mainframe. Initiate immediate aggressive legal action. I want a formal cease and desist delivered to their corporate headquarters before lunchtime. It took exactly 12 minutes for my phone to ring. I answered it immediately. The deep and resonant voice of my attorney came through the speaker, crisp and entirely devoid of panic. Elias had reviewed the data, and he was practically vibrating with professional excitement. "Sydney," he said, his tone sharp and calculating. The logs you sent are spectacular. They are not just trying to bypass a password, they are deploying active malware to try and extract the proprietary source code of your routing algorithm. This is a textbook violation of federal intellectual property laws. Your brother has officially authorized an act of corporate espionage. I smiled, looking out over the sparkling blue waters of the Miami coastline. I asked Elias exactly how much financial leverage this specific violation provided us. Elias did not hesitate. The minimum statutory damages for this level of deliberate corporate intrusion combined with the breach of the user license agreement give us grounds to file an immediate civil suit. I am drafting the cease and desist right now. I am attaching a formal notice of impending litigation. We are going to demand $5 million in immediate damages for the attempted theft of trade secrets. I felt a deep and profound sense of vindication wash over me. My family had always treated me as if my contributions were worthless. They had belittled my intelligence and openly mocked my professional dedication. Now they were about to receive a $5 million invoice for trying to steal the very technology they had once laughed at. Execute the delivery. Elias, I instructed him, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Send it via certified digital courier directly to the private email inbox of the Chief Executive Officer. I want Terrence to be sitting in his office when the reality of his situation finally breaks down his front door. Make sure a physical copy is also hand-delivered to the front reception desk of the Atlanta headquarters, just to ensure the entire executive floor understands the magnitude of what is happening. Elias confirmed the instructions and disconnected the call to finalize the legal documentation. I remained seated on my balcony, the warm tropical breeze lifting the loose strands of my hair. I pulled up my email tracking software and focused entirely on the screen. 45 minutes later, the notification pinged. The digital tracking certificate confirmed that an email bearing the letterhead of my legal counsel had been successfully delivered to the primary inbox belonging to Terrence. I watched the status indicator, holding my breath in the quiet morning air. 5 seconds later, the status changed from delivered to opened. I imagined my brother sitting in his lavish office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I imagined him opening an email he thought might contain a message of surrender from his obedient little sister. I imagined the absolute horror draining the blood from his face as he read the words, corporate espionage and intellectual property theft, and $5 million lawsuit. He had tried to use brute force and intimidation to break my spirit and steal my property. Instead, he had just handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to completely and permanently destroy his illusion of power. The silence from Atlanta was absolute and deafening. The hacking attempts against my servers ceased immediately, dropping to zero within seconds of the email being opened. Terrence finally realized he was not fighting a jealous sibling anymore. He was fighting a multi-million-dollar software company that held his entire existence in the palm of its hand. The dashboard on my screen returned to a peaceful flowing stream of green data, indicating the digital perimeter was completely secure. The sudden cessation of the cyber attacks told me everything I needed to know about the atmosphere back in the legacy logistics executive suites. The outside consulting firm Terrence had hired would have immediately recognized the severe legal peril they had been placed in. The moment they saw a federal cease and desist carrying the threat of a $5 million corporate espionage lawsuit, they would have packed up their equipment, terminated their contract, and sprinted out of the building. Nobody in the tech industry was willing to risk their professional licenses and face federal prison time just to help a desperate logistics executive steal from his own sister. Terrence was now completely isolated. His wife, Julianne, was likely still having a mental breakdown somewhere in the facility, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of the disaster she had accelerated. My father, Desmond, was probably pacing the halls demanding answers that nobody could provide. They were entirely trapped inside a sinking ship of their own making. They had spent my entire life telling me that I lacked the executive presence necessary to lead. They had continually overlooked my profound contributions while elevating a man who panicked and resorted to illegal tactics the moment he faced a genuine crisis. I closed my laptop and set it aside. I stood up and walked to the edge of the glass balcony, leaning my hands against the cool metal railing. The sun was climbing higher in the Miami sky, reflecting off the pristine ocean waves in a brilliant display of light. The storm I had unleashed upon my family was only just beginning to gather its full, devastating strength. I had given them exactly what they asked for. I had stepped away and allowed the golden child to showcase his exceptional leadership skills to the world. The $5 million legal threat currently sitting in his inbox was just the opening negotiation tactic. The real destruction was waiting just over the horizon, and I had absolutely no intention of showing them a single ounce of mercy. The third day of my self-imposed isolation broke over the Miami coastline in a spectacular display of pink and gold. I woke up leisurely, stretching against the high thread count sheets of the king-sized bed. There were no frantic morning alarms, no rushing through traffic on Interstate 85 to reach the Atlanta headquarters before Terrence needed me to explain his own daily schedule to him. There was only the gentle sound of the surf and the absolute certainty that the kingdom I had left behind was currently burning to the ground. I dressed in a lightweight linen cover-up and walked down to the private beach access. The morning air was warm and smelled of salt and freedom. I spent 2 hours at a high-end oceanfront spa, indulging in a deep tissue massage and a facial that cost more than my very first paycheck at Legacy Logistics. My phone remained locked in the drawer back at the rental property. I did not need to see the frantic notifications to know what was happening. My network of industry contacts was actively keeping me informed through my private encrypted channels. When I returned to the rental around noon, I poured myself a mimosa and opened my laptop. Renee, my former assistant, had sent a detailed summary of the morning operational disaster. The situation had escalated from a logistical nightmare into a full-blown corporate emergency. Because Julianne had purged the active routing schedules, the 60-truck fleet was completely blind. The drivers had attempted to manually reconstruct their routes using paper manifests from the previous week, but the supply chain environment was entirely dynamic. What worked last Tuesday was completely irrelevant today. The immediate consequence was missed delivery windows. Not just one or two, but dozens. The drivers were showing up at distribution centers hours late or arriving at the wrong loading docks entirely. The warehouse managers across the Southeast were furious. But the most devastating blow had landed exactly at 10 in the morning. I read Renee's message describing how the national grocery chain account, the single largest client Legacy Logistics possessed, had finally lost their patience. They relied on just-in-time delivery protocols for their perishable goods. Because our trucks were parked or wandering blindly through the interstate system, their regional distribution hubs were empty. Millions of dollars in produce and dairy were spoiling on loading docks because the transportation link had vanished. Rennie confirmed that the executive team at the grocery chain had officially submitted a formal breach of contract notice. They were threatening to terminate the entire multi-million-dollar relationship and pursue aggressive financial penalties for the lost revenue. The client exodus had begun, and Terrence was powerless to stop it. He had spent years relying on my expertise to maintain those delicate corporate relationships, and now he was facing the consequences of his own spectacular arrogance. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my mimosa as the magnitude of their failure washed over me. They had traded the operational stability of a multi-million-dollar logistics company for the aesthetic appeal of a vice president in a Chanel suit. They were currently watching millions of dollars vaporize into the humid Atlanta air, all because they refused to respect the black woman who actually built the foundation they stood upon. My encrypted messaging application chimed softly. I glanced at the screen, expecting another operational update from Renee. Instead, the notification banner displayed a different name. It was a message forwarded through a secure proxy server sent directly from my mother, Vivian. I stared at the screen, the mimosa suddenly tasting bitter on my tongue. I had intentionally blocked my family on my primary devices, but Vivian was nothing if not resourceful. She had clearly badgered Renee into forwarding a message, knowing I was likely monitoring the corporate fallout through back channels. I clicked open the message, bracing myself for the inevitable barrage of guilt trips and emotional manipulation. The text was completely devoid of her usual commanding tone. It was frantic and surprisingly vulnerable. "Sydney, please. You have made your point. The bank is calling your father. They are threatening to pull the commercial line of credit because of the missed grocery deliveries. Your brother is having a panic attack in the boardroom. Julianne left the office and will not answer her phone. The company is going to be bankrupt by the end of the week. Answer your phone right now. We need to fix this as a family. I read the message twice, absorbing the absolute desperation dripping from every single word. The bank was calling my father. The financial institutions that propped up the illusion of legacy logistics wealth were finally noticing the structural rot I had been masking for years. Terrence was breaking down under the pressure of actual leadership, and his perfect white wife had completely abandoned ship the moment the waters got rough. Vivian was begging me to return and save them under the guise of family loyalty. She wanted me to step back into the shadows to fix the disaster they created and quietly allow them to maintain their positions of power. She expected the obedient daughter to rush home and sacrifice her own peace to protect the fragile ego of the golden child. I looked at the message from my mother one final time. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the familiar pull of obligation that had controlled my life for 32 years. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound and cold sense of justice. I moved my cursor over the message and clicked the delete icon. The frantic text vanished from my screen, erased as completely as their respect for my contributions. I closed the encrypted application and shut the laptop firmly. The sun was bright and the ocean was calling. I picked up my empty glass, walked back into the kitchen, and poured myself another mimosa. The collapse of legacy logistics was no longer my problem. It was their legacy, and they could burn with it. I was back in my midtown Atlanta penthouse, arranging fresh-cut orchids in a heavy crystal vase, when the aggressive hammering on my front door started. It was not a polite and measured knock. It was the frantic and heavy pounding of people who believed the rules of common decency did not apply to them. My private concierge downstairs usually screened all visitors with strict instructions not to let anyone up unannounced, but my family had always treated boundaries like mere suggestions. They had clearly bypassed the security desk by leveraging my father and his recognizable face, likely bullying the young attendant in the lobby until he handed over the elevator override key. I placed the final purple orchid stem into the water, dried my hands slowly on a plush linen towel, and walked with deliberate calm toward the foyer. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the solid oak door open. Terrence pushed his way inside before the door was even fully ajar, nearly knocking me backward. He was sweating profusely through a wrinkled blue dress shirt that looked like he had been sleeping in it for 3 consecutive days. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent and deep, highlighting the absolute exhaustion of a man who was entirely out of his depth. Julianne trailed closely behind him, her previously immaculate blonde hair pulled into a messy and frizzy knot. My parents, Desmond and Vivian, brought up the rear, walking into my private sanctuary with expressions of absolute righteous fury mixed with poorly concealed terror. They stood in the center of my spacious living room, looking completely out of place against the modern minimalist decor and the panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. I closed the front door quietly and leaned against the glass console table. I did not ask them why they had invaded my home without calling first. I did not ask them how the National Grocery account was doing, or if the trucks had finally left the loading docks. I simply looked at the 4 of them and let their desperate, unhinged energy suffocate the room. I walked past my seething brother and stepped behind my large marble kitchen island. I opened the stainless steel refrigerator and pulled out a chilled glass pitcher of sparkling water. I took my absolute time arranging 4 heavy crystal glasses on the counter, slicing fresh lemon wedges with precise and deliberate movements. The clinking of the ice cubes against the glass was the only sound in the room, stretching the tension until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on all of them. "Would anyone care for some water?" I asked, my voice perfectly pleasant and accommodating, as if I were hosting a casual afternoon tea instead of facing a hostile home invasion. The drive over here from Buckhead traffic must have been terrible this time of day, considering you had to navigate through the city without a proper routing schedule. Terrence slapped his hand down on the marble countertop so hard the crystal glasses vibrated against each other, spilling a few drops of water onto the pristine surface. "Stop playing these sick games, Sydney," he barked, his voice cracking with pure exhaustion and panic. "You know exactly why we are here, and you know what you are doing to us. The entire operation is completely paralyzed. The warehouse managers are threatening a mass walkout by tomorrow morning, and the bank just froze the operational liquidity accounts because we missed the revenue deposit minimums. You have ruined everything. My mother stepped forward, physically pushing Terrence aside to take control of the narrative. She pressed her hand tightly against her chest, executing a flawless performance of the wounded matriarch who had been betrayed by her ungrateful offspring. "How can you do this to your own blood, Sydney?" she wailed, her voice carrying a dramatic and theatrical tremor meant to induce immediate submission. "Your father is having chest pains. His blood pressure is through the roof because of the stress you are causing him. He built that company with his bare hands to provide for this family, and you are sitting here sipping fancy water in a luxury penthouse while you try to destroy his entire legacy over a petty workplace disagreement." I looked over at Desmond. He was indeed breathing heavily, leaning against the back of my white leather sofa for physical support, but his eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated anger rather than actual medical pain. He expected me to crumble at the sight of his manufactured distress. He expected the dutiful and forgotten daughter to rush forward with immediate apologies and blind promises of salvation. He thought his mere presence in my home was enough to bully me back into submission so he could return to sitting in his leather chair while I did all the heavy lifting. Julianne decided this was her golden moment to assert the executive dominance she falsely believed she possessed. She marched right up to the edge of the kitchen island, invading my personal space with that familiar toxic entitlement. She placed both her hands flat on my clean counter and glared at me, breathing heavily through her nose. "Sydney, this ridiculous prank is officially over," Julianne snapped, crossing her arms over her chest in a highly defensive posture. "You have had your little tantrum, but you are causing actual financial damage to my department, and I will not tolerate it anymore. As the Vice President of Operations, I am demanding that you hand over the master passwords to the routing software right now, or I am calling the Atlanta Police Department and having you arrested for corporate theft. You stole company property when you locked us out of those servers, and we are going to press felony charges against you if you do not restore my administrative access immediately." The silence that followed her threat was profound and heavy. I looked at Julianne standing there in her wrinkled designer clothes, trying to threaten a black woman in her own home, using the police as a weapon. She actually thought the software belonged to Legacy Logistics simply because she sat in a nice chair and demanded it. She truly believed that raising her voice and using legal buzzwords would intimidate me into handing over my life work. The sheer absurdity of her ignorance, the absolute blind arrogance of her demand, finally broke my neutral facade entirely. A laugh bubbled up from deep inside my chest. It started as a soft and low chuckle and quickly escalated into a full and genuine laugh that echoed brightly off the high ceilings of my penthouse. I could not stop laughing at the sheer comedic brilliance of her absolute stupidity. Terrence looked at me like I had completely lost my mind, taking a slow step backward. My mother stopped her theatrical gasping and stared at me in absolute paralyzed shock. My father pushed himself off the sofa, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as he realized his intimidation tactics were failing spectacularly. I did not stop laughing as I turned my back on them and walked casually over to the discreet digital safe built seamlessly into the custom walnut cabinetry behind my kitchen island. I tapped in my 6-digit security code, and the heavy steel door clicked open with a smooth mechanical hum. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legally binding documents bound in a premium black leather folio. I walked back to the kitchen island and dropped the heavy stack of documents right in front of Julianne. The heavy thud of the paper made her flinch and take a sudden, terrified step backward. Her confidence was already beginning to fracture under the weight of my complete and utter lack of fear. I leaned over the marble counter, resting my weight on my forearms, and looked directly into her wide and terrified blue eyes. "Call them, Julianne," I whispered, my voice dropping to a deadly and terrifying calm that stripped away all the remaining warmth in the room. "Call the police right now. Let us see exactly who goes to jail." Julianne stared at the heavy black leather folio resting on the pristine marble surface of my kitchen island. Her chest was heaving with rapid and shallow breaths, but she did not reach out to touch the paperwork. Her threat to call the Atlanta Police Department hung in the air, completely neutralized by the absolute certainty in my voice. I did not break eye contact with her as I reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover of the folio. I spread the documents out across the counter, so the bold legal headers were perfectly visible under the warm pendant lights hanging above us. "Read them." Julianne, I offered, my tone dangerously smooth and completely void of any emotional hesitation. "Those are the official United States patent and trademark registration documents for the Apex Data Solutions routing matrix. You will notice that the sole registered owner and patent holder is my private limited liability company. There is absolutely no mention of legacy logistics anywhere on those pages. I own the proprietary software code. I own the server architecture. I own every single line of dynamic data that makes this shipping empire function on a daily basis. Legacy Logistics does not own a single digital byte of the system you are currently trying to claim as corporate property." My father Desmond stepped away from the white leather sofa and moved slowly toward the kitchen island. His heavy footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor as he approached the spread-out documents. He squinted at the complex legal terminology, his face draining of color as the reality of the situation began to penetrate his deeply rooted and stubborn arrogance. "What exactly does this mean, Sydney?" he asked, his voice stripped of all its previous booming authority and reduced to a gravelly and uncertain rasp. "It means, Dad," I explained, turning my attention directly to him, "that for the past 3 years, Legacy Logistics has been operating entirely on a temporary and highly conditional free trial license." I shifted my gaze to Terrence, who was leaning heavily against the wall near the stainless steel refrigerator, looking like he was about to physically collapse onto the floor. His expensive blue dress shirt was clinging to his chest, dark with terrified sweat. "I presented a customized user agreement to our highly capable chief executive officer exactly 3 years ago." I continued, my voice projecting cleanly across the open concept penthouse. I distinctly remember sliding the contract across his massive mahogany desk while he was busy browsing luxury catering options for a corporate golf tournament. He signed the free trial agreement without reading a single page of the document. He legally bound your company to a clause that clearly stated the free access license would immediately and automatically terminate if the primary administrative owner was no longer employed by the licensee. You fired me, Terrence. You stripped away my hard-earned title and handed it to your completely unqualified wife. And in doing so, you legally and permanently terminated your own operational access to my software. Vivian let out a sharp and ragged gasp from the center of the living room. She pressed both her hands over her mouth, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a ruthless and terrifying stranger. She had spent my entire life expecting me to bow my head and absorb their disrespect. But now she was watching me systematically dismantle their entire source of generational wealth using nothing but ink and paper. Desmond leaned heavily against the marble island, his massive hands gripping the cold edges of the counter for physical support. He looked down at the patent documents again, tracing the official government seals with a trembling finger. He finally looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated defeat. His pride was completely shattered, and he realized he was standing in the home of the woman who held his actual legacy in her hands. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough and completely hollow. "How much is it going to cost to get the software back online and get my trucks moving again?" I did not look at my father. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my older brother. Terrence was staring at the floor, his breathing ragged and uneven. "The new licensing fee for corporate enterprise access is $250,000 a month," I stated, letting the massive financial figure ring through the quiet air of the penthouse. "And because Legacy Logistics is currently categorized as a high-risk client due to your recent operational instability and your terrible client retention, I am requiring the first month payment to be wired into the Apex Data Solutions holding account immediately. The absolute moment the funds clear my secure escrow account, I will manually restore the routing matrices and get your drivers off the loading docks." Julianne shook her head violently, her messy blonde hair falling wildly around her pale and terrified face. $250,000 a month, she shrieked, her voice pitching upward into a hysterical and grating register. That is absolute extortion, Sydney. We cannot afford to pay you $250,000 every single month just to run the dispatch floor. We are already bleeding cash because of the grocery account penalties and the lost transit miles. You are trying to bankrupt us on purpose. I ignored her completely, brushing past her hysterical outburst as if she had not even spoken. I kept my focus pinned squarely on my brother, waiting for the golden child to finally step up and take responsibility for his crumbling empire. I am waiting, Terrence, I said softly, the challenge hanging heavy in the air between us. You are the chief executive officer of this prestigious family legacy. You told me in the parking garage that you control the narrative in this city. So control it. Authorize the wire transfer right now and save your father's company. Terrence slowly lifted his head. His face was pale and completely devoid of blood, looking almost translucent under the modern lighting of my kitchen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He tried again, swallowing hard against the massive lump of panic lodged in his throat. His eyes darted from me to Julianne and finally rested on our father, who was watching him with an intense and demanding expectation. I cannot pay that! Sidney Terrence finally stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic and high-pitched whisper that echoed off the high ceilings. I cannot authorize the wire transfer. The company operating accounts are completely frozen. The entire room went dead silent. The air was suddenly sucked out of the penthouse, leaving a suffocating and terrifying vacuum in its wake. Vivian dropped her hands from her face and stared at her son in absolute horror. Julianne backed away from the kitchen island, her eyes wide with a new and entirely different kind of terror. Desmond straightened his posture, pushing himself off the marble island with a sudden burst of violent and desperate energy. He lunged forward, bridging the gap between them in two massive strides, and grabbed Terrence violently by the collar of his expensive blue dress shirt. Frozen, Desmond roared, spraying saliva across the space between them as his booming voice returned with a vengeance. His massive hands twisted the fabric of Terrence's shirt, pulling his grown son forcefully toward him until they were standing nose to nose. What do you mean, frozen, Terrence? Why the hell are the company accounts frozen? The echo of Desmond, roaring at his son, seemed to rattle the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. Terrence was physically shaking his expensive dress shirt, now completely soaked in nervous sweat, as our father kept a white-knuckled grip on his collar. I remained leaning casually against the kitchen island, watching the spectacular implosion of the patriarchal hierarchy they had both worshipped for decades. Desmond shook him again, demanding an answer with a volume that commanded absolute obedience. Terrence finally broke. The arrogant chief executive officer persona he had worn like a cheap suit completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified little boy who had just been caught stealing from the cookie jar. He raised his hands in a defensive gesture, stepping back as Desmond finally released his grip in sheer disgust. Terrence could not look at our father. He could not look at our mother, who was standing frozen in the center of the living room. He stared down at the pristine hardwood floor and began to stammer out a confession that would permanently destroy the legacy logistics empire. It was the operational reserves. Terrence mumbled, his voice trembling so badly the words barely formed. The banks mandate a specific liquidity threshold to maintain our commercial credit lines. But Julianne and I, we needed capital. We needed cash to float the renovations on the Buckhead estate and the closing costs for the vacation property in Aspen. Desmond took a heavy step backward, as if he had just been physically struck in the chest. You touched the operational reserves, he asked, his voice dropping from a roar into a dangerous and deadly quiet. You stole liquid capital from the company emergency funds to pay for your house. It was not just the house, Terrence sobbed, the dam finally breaking as the truth flooded out of him. It was the cars, the first-class tickets to Paris. Julianne needed a wardrobe budget to fit her new role as a corporate executive wife. We used the corporate accounts to cover our lifestyle overhead. We thought it was a temporary loan. We planned to pay it back at the end of the fiscal year when the quarterly bonuses paid out. Vivian let out a sharp cry, pressing her hands against her temples. You embezzled from your own she whispered, her entire worldview fracturing right in front of my eyes. You stole from the business your father built with his bare hands. Terence looked up, tears actually streaming down his cheeks. "We did not think anyone would notice," he cried, gesturing frantically toward me. Sydney was running the supply chain so efficiently. Her routing software was cutting operational costs by 30% every single month. The profit margins were so wide we thought the company could easily absorb our personal withdrawals. We thought Sydney would just keep finding ways to optimize the budget and cover the gaps. We thought she would just keep working and keeping her head down like she always did. I stood there listening to my own brother admit that he had deliberately weaponized my brilliance and my relentless work ethic to fund his own personal embezzlement. They had treated me like a pack mule, assuming I would just blindly pull the cart forward, no matter how much heavy and illegal baggage they loaded onto my back. They had stolen from the family legacy and counted on my black excellence to hide their financial crimes. Desmond looked absolutely sick. His broad shoulders slumped, and he suddenly looked like a very old and broken man. He had handed the keys to his kingdom to a son who lacked the discipline, the intelligence, and the moral compass to protect it. Before Desmond could say another word, Julianne suddenly stepped forward. The terrified woman who had been backing away from my kitchen island just moments ago was suddenly replaced by a vicious and cornered animal. She had realized that the bank accounts were frozen, the money was gone, and her luxurious lifestyle was about to evaporate into thin air. She turned her absolute rage toward her husband. "You are so pathetic," Terence Julianne screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the penthouse. She pointed an accusing manicured finger directly at his face. "You are a weak and spineless man. You are the chief executive officer, but you stand here crying and cowering in front of your daddy and your bitter little sister. You promised me a lifestyle of luxury and corporate power, but you cannot even control your own employees." Terence looked at his wife in pure shock, holding his hands out as if to calm her down, but Julianne was entirely beyond reason. The carefully constructed mask of the polite and supportive corporate wife slipped away completely, revealing the deeply ingrained and toxic racial biases she had been hiding since the day Terence brought her home. "I should have known better than to marry into this mess." Julianne spat, her face twisting into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at my father, then at my mother, and finally at me, sweeping her gaze over us with absolute contempt. "You all walk around Atlanta, acting like you are some kind of high society dynasty, just because you own a few dozen dirty delivery trucks. You think you are corporate elites, but look at yourselves. You are tearing each other apart in a kitchen over a software program. This entire family business is nothing but a ghetto operation anyway." The word hung in the air, dripping with venom and historical disrespect. Ghetto operation. Vivian gasped loudly, taking a physical step backward, as if Julianne had just slapped her across the face. Desmond stiffened, his jaw clenching so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. They had welcomed this white woman into their home. They had elevated her over their own daughter. They had funded her designer wardrobe and her luxury vacations. And the moment the money stopped flowing, she looked right at them and reduced their entire generational legacy to a racist stereotype. "I am done with this pathetic excuse for a family," Julianne yelled, grabbing her expensive designer handbag from the sofa. "I am not going down with this sinking ship. I am calling my lawyers, and I am filing for divorce before the federal authorities start looking into those frozen bank accounts. You can all rot in prison for all I care." She turned on her designer heel and marched toward the front door of my penthouse. None of us moved to stop her. We stood in absolute silence, listening to the heavy brass deadbolt unlock and the door slam shut behind her, leaving a toxic and echoing silence in her wake. Terence was breathing rapidly, staring at the empty space where his wife had just been standing. His entire life had just been dismantled in the span of 10 minutes. He had lost his authority, his money, and his marriage. He looked at my parents, his eyes pleading for some kind of maternal or paternal comfort. But Desmond and Vivian simply stared at him with cold and unyielding disgust. They finally saw him for exactly what he was. The deafening silence in the room was suddenly broken by a sharp digital chime. It came from the pocket of Terrence's dress shirt. It was the distinct and custom alert tone he used for urgent administrative emails from the Legacy Logistics headquarters. Terrence flinched at the sound. His hands were shaking violently as he slowly reached into his chest pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the glass for a long, agonizing moment before he swiped to open the notification. I watched as my brother read the message on his screen. I watched the last remaining shreds of his sanity and his physical strength completely vanish. His knees actually buckled. He dropped straight down onto the polished hardwood floor of my living room, landing hard on his knees with a dull and heavy thud. The cell phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the floor beside him. Terrence stared blankly at the wall, his breathing shallow and erratic. His voice, when he finally spoke, sounded completely dead. "It is a 24-hour eviction notice," Terrence whispered into the quiet room, not looking at any of us. "The commercial landlords are sending armed security guards to lock down our main distribution warehouse in the morning. They are shutting the gates and impounding the entire trucking fleet. We have not paid the commercial property rent in 4 straight months." Desmond grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my coat through his trembling grip. His face was entirely drained of color, his ego completely stripped away as he looked at me with bloodshot, pleading eyes. "You know the real estate brokers, Sydney?" Desmond begged, his voice cracking beneath the immense weight of his desperation. "Call the landlord right now. Use your connections. Use whatever leverage you have to beg for a 30-day extension, please. If we get locked out today, we lose the government contract. We lose the machinery. We lose everything. Please, Sydney." At the head of the polished conference table, Terrence let out a cruel, mocking sneer, tossing a thick stack of eviction notices onto the mahogany wood. "It is over, Desmond. The eviction notice was served 3 weeks ago. The property management firm gave explicit instructions to lock the gates at noon sharp. Your little girl can call whoever she wants, but no corporate landlord on earth is going to show mercy to a failing company that is 3 months behind on rent." I sat back quietly, listening to the echoing silence of the boardroom. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't panic. Instead, I picked up my glass of ice water, taking a long, deliberate sip as the two men stared at me, one begging for salvation and the other gloating over a ruin he thought he had engineered. I set the glass down with a soft click against the wood. "I don't need to call the landlord, Dad," I said, my voice steady, smooth, and echoing with absolute authority across the room. Desmond blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about, Sydney? This isn't the time for games." I looked past my father, locking eyes with Terrence, whose arrogant smile was slowly beginning to falter under my unbothered gaze. "I don't need to call the landlord," I repeated calmly, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. "Because I am the landlord." The room plunged into an absolute suffocating silence. Desmond froze, his hand slipping off my arm as if he had just been burned. Terrence let out a nervous, breathless laugh, shaking his head. "That is ridiculous. The deed to this entire industrial park is held by Apex Horizon Holdings, an offshore blind trust. You are bluffing." "6 months ago," I said, ignoring Terrence entirely as I looked directly at my father. "When you were busy transferring company assets into Terrence's name and telling the board that I was too emotional and inexperienced to handle executive decisions, I closed the deal on my proprietary logistics software. A major tech conglomerate purchased the patent rights for $72 million. Desmond gasped, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process the number. 72 million. "I didn't buy a sports car, Dad. I didn't buy a mansion," I continued smoothly, my voice carrying the unshakable weight of absolute victory. "I created Apex Horizon Holdings, and my very first acquisition was this exact 100,000 square foot facility that you are currently standing in. I bought the deed, the land, and the entire property management firm 3 months ago." Terrence slammed both palms onto the table, standing up so fast, his leather chair crashed backward onto the floor. "You're lying. That is legally impossible." The property manager answered directly to the corporate board. "The property manager answers to me, Terrence," I said softly, reaching into my leather briefcase and pulling out a thick, leather-bound document stamped with the official seal of the State Land Registry. I slid it across the table. It came to a stop right in front of him. "Page 4, the title deed. Feel free to check the signature of the ultimate beneficial owner at the bottom." Terrence frantically grabbed the pages, his hands shaking as he flipped through the legal filings. As his eyes scanned the official registry stamps, the last bit of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. No, no, this can't be. Desmond stared at the legal documents in Terrence's hands, then looked back at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying mix of shock, awe, and sudden realization. Sydney, you bought the building, the entire facility. Every single square foot, I said softly. Which means, Terrence, that the eviction notice you hold in your hand wasn't requested by the bank. It was authorized by me. The property management firm didn't give instructions to lock the gates at noon on their own initiative. They received those instructions directly from my office. Terrence dropped the paper, his arrogant composure completely shattered as he looked at me in absolute horror. You set this up. You spent the last 3 years undermining my work, squeezing me out of the company my grandfather built, and convincing my father that I was worthless. I said, standing up slowly and buttoning my suit jacket. You thought you were backing me into a corner. You thought you were taking everything away from me today. But while you were playing corporate games in this boardroom, I bought the ground you were standing on. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open. 2 uniformed security officers stepped into the room, followed by the head of the local sheriff's department. Ms. Sidney, the sheriff said, nodding respectfully to me. The perimeter is secured. The lock replacement crew is standing by outside. Thank you, Sheriff, I replied smoothly, without taking my eyes off Terrence. Please escort Mr. Terrence off the premises immediately. His personal belongings have already been packed into cardboard boxes and placed by the security gate outside. Wait! Terrence panicked, backing away as the 2 officers moved toward him. You can't do this, Desmond. Tell her we have a partnership. We have a contract. Desmond sat completely paralyzed, looking between Terrence and me, totally speechless as the officers grabbed Terrence by his arms. Get your hands off me! Terrence shouted, his voice cracking into a desperate shriek as he was forcefully hauled toward the door. Sydney, wait. We can negotiate. We can renegotiate the lease terms, Sydney. His frantic shouting echoed down the long hallway until the heavy double doors closed, cutting his voice off completely. Silence descended upon the room once more. My father remained seated at the table looking at me, as if he were seeing me for the very first time in his life. The man who had dismissed me, favored everyone else over me, and treated me like an afterthought was now trembling in the shadow of the empire I had built in silence. I picked up my briefcase, resting my hand on the leather handle. Pack your personal items by 5 o'clock today, Dad, I said quietly, my voice filled with a peaceful, unbreakable strength. The new tenant moves in on Monday, and unlike you, they pay their rent on time. The sound of Terrence whispering about the 24-hour eviction notice hung in the air of my midtown penthouse like a suffocating physical weight. Desmond stared down at his son with an expression of absolute and hollow defeat. His broad shoulders slumped forward entirely, erasing the powerful and intimidating posture he had carried for his entire life. Vivian was clutching the sharp edge of the glass console table as if the entire room had just violently tilted beneath her feet. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. I stood firmly behind my pristine marble kitchen island and watched the mighty shipping empire my father had built crumble into digital and financial dust right in front of his eyes. Terrence remained on his knees, staring at the floor. The reality of his profound incompetence had finally broken through his thick layer of unearned arrogance. He had spent the last 3 years taking absolute credit for my late nights and my strategic brilliance while treating me like an expendable asset. Now he was facing the brutal and unforgiving consequences of attempting to steer a massive ship he fundamentally did not understand. You have absolutely nothing left, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, cutting smoothly through their heavy and panicked breathing. Let us review the exact reality of your current situation right now. You do not own the proprietary routing software that keeps your fleet of trucks moving, because my private company owns every single line of that code. You do not own the sprawling distribution warehouse that houses your commercial freight, because I personally bought the deed to that property 6 months ago through an anonymous blind trust. And thanks to your brilliant new vice president and your own spectacular financial mismanagement, you have absolutely zero cash left in your operational reserves. Desmond looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The aggressive corporate patriarch who had demanded my submission at the Thanksgiving dinner table was completely gone. "You bought the warehouse?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound shock and sheer visceral terror. "I used the massive profits from selling my software licenses to other national transport companies," I explained, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the fabric of my blazer. "I quietly purchased the 100,000 square foot facility you currently operate out of. The commercial property management company answers directly to me." The eviction notice Terrence is holding on his phone was not automatically generated by a random bank. It was actively requested and authorized by my office because my tenants failed to pay their commercial rent for 4 consecutive months. I stepped out from behind the kitchen island and walked slowly toward the center of the living room. Legacy Logistics is no longer a functioning business. I continued, letting each word strike them like a physical blow. It is just a fancy name, printed on a piece of letterhead. You have no physical infrastructure, no digital network, and no cash flow to survive the week. Without me manually restoring your access and formally halting the eviction process, you will be completely and legally bankrupt by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The absolute finality of my words hit the room like a localized earthquake. Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, unable to face the reality of his complete destruction. Desmond covered his face with his massive hands, finally understanding that the daughter he routinely cast aside was the only thing holding his entire existence together. Vivian let out a soft and pathetic whimper, realizing her days of country club lunches and expensive jewelry were permanently over. But Julianne refused to accept reality. The sudden and violent realization that she was not going to be a wealthy corporate wife, and that her luxury lifestyle had evaporated overnight, caused her brain to completely short-circuit. She let out a visceral, piercing scream that tore through the quiet elegance of my living room. "You ruined my life!" Julianne shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You planned this from the very beginning, you vindictive, bitter woman. You stole our money and you destroyed my marriage on purpose." Before anyone could react, Julianne lunged forward. She threw her expensive designer handbag onto the hardwood floor and charged directly at me, her hands reaching out like claws aimed straight for my face. She was completely out of her mind, driven by the sheer desperation of a woman losing her unearned privilege and facing the brutal consequences of her own actions. I did not flinch. I did not even take a single step backward to defend myself. The heavy front door of my penthouse suddenly swung wide open. I had intentionally left the brass deadbolt unlocked when they arrived, knowing exactly how volatile and violent this confrontation might become once the truth was revealed. My private security team had been waiting silently in the carpeted hallway the entire time, monitoring the audio feed from my internal security cameras. 2 massive and highly trained guards stepped into the living room, moving with incredible speed and professional efficiency. Before Julianne could get within 3 feet of me, the lead guard stepped smoothly between us. He caught her by the arms, twisting her forward momentum effortlessly, and pinned both her wrists firmly behind her back. Julianne thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the empty air and screaming furious obscenities that echoed loudly off the high ceilings. "Let me go, you animals!" she cried, her voice going hoarse as she struggled helplessly against the completely immovable physical grip of the security team. Desmond and Vivian jumped back in terror, watching their perfect white daughter-in-law being physically restrained in the middle of my living room like a common violent criminal. The sophisticated corporate image she had tried to project was entirely gone, leaving nothing but a desperate and pathetic shell of a woman. She attempted to physically assault the homeowner, the lead guard stated calmly, looking directly at me for instructions while keeping Julianne firmly locked in place. "Would you like us to contact the Atlanta Police Department and press formal charges for attempted battery and trespassing, ma'am?" I looked at Julianne, who was now crying angry and humiliated tears as she realized how completely powerless she truly was in my domain. She was breathing heavily, her face red and streaked with ruined expensive makeup. She glared at me with pure hatred, but the fight had been completely drained out of her, leaving only the terrifying reality of her impending exit. "No," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on Julianne and maintaining my cool and unbothered posture. That will not be necessary today. Just escort her out of my building and ensure she does not attempt to access the residential property again. If she sets one single foot inside the main lobby downstairs, call the authorities immediately and have her arrested. The guards nodded in unison and began walking Julianne backward toward the open front door. She did not fight them anymore. Terrence did not even turn his head to watch his wife being forcibly removed from the premises. He remained completely frozen on the floor, utterly broken by the crushing weight of his own monumental failures and the loss of his entire false empire. Once the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the security team, I turned my attention back to my parents and my brother. The silence they left behind in my penthouse was incredibly thick and heavy. Vivian was shaking visibly, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as if she were freezing cold. Desmond looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 30 minutes, staring at the floor with blank and defeated eyes. I walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up my cell phone, checking the time on the digital display. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my living room. The day was ending, and their reign over my life was officially over. I looked at my father and then down at my brother, who was still kneeling in the absolute ruins of his short-lived executive career. I have called an emergency meeting with your silent investors for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I said, my voice ringing with absolute and terrifying finality. They have been fully briefed on the massive financial discrepancies and the unauthorized withdrawal of the operational reserves. They are expecting a comprehensive and detailed explanation for the missing capital and the complete operational failure of the supply chain network. Terrence finally looked up, his eyes wide with renewed and profound terror. The silent investors were ruthless business partners who did not tolerate financial incompetence or embezzlement. Facing them without a functional company or a cash reserve to hide behind was the corporate equivalent of walking blindly into a firing squad. Do not be late, I added, taking a slow and deliberate step toward the hallway to signal that this meeting was officially and permanently over. And make sure you bring a pen. The morning sun reflecting off the Atlanta skyline was blinding, but the atmosphere inside the 40th floor boardroom of Legacy Logistics was colder than a morgue. I stepped out of the executive elevator precisely at 9 o'clock, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit like absolute armor. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, mimicking the exact rhythm of my departure just 4 days prior. But the power dynamic in the room had completely inverted. I walked through the heavy glass doors and took in the spectacular wreckage of my father's empire. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the 5 silent investors who provided the initial capital for Legacy Logistics decades ago. These were wealthy, ruthless older men who cared only about their quarterly dividends and their return on investment. Right now, they looked ready to commit actual murder. Terrence was sitting near the middle of the table. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands were trembling so badly he had to keep them pressed flat against the wood. Desmond sat at the head of the table, staring blankly at the empty leather chair next to him. Julianne was noticeably absent. I had personally ensured that my new property management security team formally banned her from entering the commercial complex. She was likely sitting in her heavily mortgaged Buckhead mansion, waiting for the inevitable knock of federal authorities. I bypassed my old seat entirely and walked straight toward the opposite end of the table, standing directly facing my father. I did not offer a polite morning greeting to the men in the room. I did not apologize for the sudden emergency meeting. I simply opened my leather briefcase and pulled out 5 thick, perfectly bound dossiers. I walked around the perimeter of the mahogany table, handing one copy to each of the silent investors. I deliberately bypassed Terrence and Desmond, leaving them completely in the dark. These men respect data, and I was about to give them a masterclass in forensic accounting. I walked back to my spot at the end of the table and folded my hands. Gentlemen, I began, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the tense room. What you hold in your hands is a comprehensive and fully verified forensic audit of the Legacy Logistics operational reserves spanning the last 24 months. I cross-referenced the bank statements against the internal routing costs. I highly recommend you turn to page 4. The rustling of heavy paper filled the silent room as the 5 investors simultaneously opened their folders. I watched their eyes scan the neatly organized columns of numbers. I had categorized every single unauthorized withdrawal, every fabricated expense report, and every diverted corporate fund. Within 30 seconds, the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Marcus, the lead investor, and a man who had known my father for 30 years, let out a sharp and furious breath. His face turned a dark shade of purple as he read the specific line items I had highlighted in bright red ink. You will notice, I continued, keeping my tone completely devoid of emotion, that the chief executive officer of this company has been systematically draining the liquid capital to fund his personal lifestyle. The operational reserves were completely depleted to secure the closing costs on a vacation property in Aspen and to fund a $200,000 renovation on his primary residence. Furthermore, if you turn to page 7, you will see the corporate credit card expenditures authorized by his wife, Julianne, during her brief and highly destructive tenure as vice president of operations. She charged over $80,000 in designer clothing, luxury spa retreats, and first-class international travel, under the guise of corporate networking and brand management. The total amount of embezzled funds exceeds $1.4 million. The absolute silence in the boardroom was suddenly shattered when Marcus slammed his hand down on the table so violently the coffee cups rattled in their saucers. He stood up, pushing his chair back, and pointed a shaking finger directly at Terrence. "You stole from us!" Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You took our investment capital, and you bought yourself a mountain house while your trucks were sitting empty on the loading docks." Terrence flinched, visibly shrinking down into his expensive suit. He looked absolutely pathetic. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but his voice cracked and failed him completely. Desmond finally found his voice, trying desperately to shield the golden child from the incoming slaughter. "Marcus, please," Desmond pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "We can explain the discrepancies. It was a temporary reallocation of funds. We were planning to replace the capital at the end of the fiscal quarter. The company is just facing a brief liquidity crisis." Marcus turned his furious glare onto my father. "A brief liquidity crisis, Desmond," he spat out the words like poison. "Your son committed federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He stole our money. And according to the documents Sydney just handed us, he also failed to pay the commercial rent for 4 months, resulting in a total lockdown of the primary distribution warehouse. The business is functionally dead." The other investors began shouting over each other, demanding immediate answers and threatening to call the Securities and Exchange Commission. One of them pulled out his phone, preparing to contact his legal team to file an emergency injunction against my brother. Terrence put his head in his hands and actually began to cry, right there in the middle of the boardroom. The heir apparent, the visionary leader of the family legacy, was weeping openly because he had finally run out of places to hide his profound incompetence. I stood silently at the end of the table, watching the total destruction of the patriarchal hierarchy that had held me down for my entire life. The shouting continued for several minutes, until Marcus finally raised his hands, demanding silence. He took a deep breath, adjusting his suit jacket, and turned his attention away from the ruined men at the center of the table. He looked directly at me. His expression shifted from blind rage to intense and highly focused calculation. The investors were ruthless businessmen, and they quickly realized that screaming at a bankrupt CEO was not going to recover their lost millions. They knew exactly who was holding all the cards. Sidney, Marcus said, his voice dropping back to a professional and serious register. "You did not call us here just to hand out audit reports and watch your brother go to federal prison. You own the proprietary routing software that runs the trucks. Your legal team confirmed you purchased the physical warehouse facility 6 months ago. You are the only person holding the operational keys to this entire enterprise." The other investors fell completely silent, turning their chairs to face me. Desmond looked up, his eyes wide and terrified, as he realized the men he had partnered with for decades were officially bypassing his authority and recognizing me as the sole power in the room. Terrence kept his face buried in his hands, softly sobbing into his palms. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany wood. He looked at the audit report, then looked right back into my eyes. The company is bankrupt by 5 o'clock today without your intervention, Marcus stated plainly. What is your proposal? Marcus sat perfectly still, waiting for my answer. The remaining four investors mirrored his posture, leaning forward with their hands clasped over the polished mahogany wood. I did not speak immediately. I let the silence stretch out and wrap around the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I looked at my father, Desmond, who was staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and reluctant awe. I looked at my brother Terence, whose face was buried in his trembling hands. They had spent 32 years treating me like an invisible workhorse, and now their entire future hung on whatever words I chose to speak next. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and I was going to make them feel every single second of it. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper. I placed it flat on the table in front of me, pressing my fingertips against the edges. My proposal is entirely non-negotiable, I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls of the boardroom. I will not entertain counteroffers, and I will not accept partial agreements. You either accept the terms exactly as I lay them out, or Legacy Logistics dies at 5 o'clock today and every single one of your investments goes up in smoke. The investors nodded in unison. They were financial sharks, and they recognized an apex predator circling the bloody water. They did not care about our toxic family dynamics or the damaged egos of the men sitting beside them. They only cared about saving their capital, and I was the absolute only lifeline left in the ocean. I looked directly at Marcus, locking eyes with the most powerful man in the room. First, I will immediately waive the outstanding commercial rent for the distribution warehouse. My property management firm will halt the eviction process, and the gates will remain open. Second, I will personally authorize Apex Data Solutions to restore the proprietary routing software network. Your trucks will be fully operational and visible on the grid within 5 minutes of the paperwork being finalized. Third, I will personally inject $1 million of my own liquid capital directly into the Legacy Logistics operational accounts. This cash injection will cover the immediate grocery client penalties and stabilize the daily cash flow so the drivers can get paid on Friday. The collective sigh of relief from the investors was audible. Marcus let his broad shoulders drop slightly against his chair. $1 million cash injection combined with the restored software would be enough to calm the panicked grocery executives and keep the business breathing. Desmond actually closed his eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. He thought I was stepping in to save his legacy out of some misplaced sense of daughterly duty or familial loyalty. He thought the nightmare was finally over and he could go back to his country club. But I was not stepping in to save his legacy. I was stepping in to conquer it completely. I picked up the single sheet of paper and slid it down the center of the long mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of Marcus. Those are my terms for salvation. I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly serious register that demanded absolute silence. Now let us discuss the price. In exchange for saving this company from complete and total bankruptcy, Terence will immediately surrender his title as Chief Executive Officer. He will also surrender every single share of corporate stock currently registered in his name, without any financial compensation. Desmond, you will step down as chairman of the board, effective immediately, and you will completely surrender your voting rights. I require 65% controlling ownership of Legacy Logistics, and I am purchasing that controlling stake for exactly $1. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Desmond slammed his heavy fists onto the table, pushing himself up from his chair so violently it nearly tipped backward. His face turned a dark, violent shade of red. You are completely out of your mind, Desmond roared, pointing a shaking finger at me across the length of the table. You think you can walk in here and steal my company for $1? I built this empire from nothing. You are trying to strip your own father and your own brother of everything we own. I did not even blink. I did not raise my voice to match his manufactured outrage. You do not own anything anymore, Dad, I replied smoothly, leaning forward slightly. Terence stole the operational funds to buy a mountain house. Julianne burned the bridges with the clients to play dress-up. The bank is actively foreclosing on your credit lines as we speak. I am not stealing your company. I am buying a burning building and I am charging you for the water to put out the fire. Marcus picked up the printed contract and read over the terms. He did not look angry at all. He looked incredibly impressed. The other investors leaned over his shoulder to read the strict legal stipulations. They did not care if Desmond lost his chairmanship or if Terence was stripped of his unearned title. They only cared that the woman offering them $1 million lifeline was clearly the smartest and most capable person in the room. Terence finally lifted his head from his hands. His face was covered in tears and cold sweat. The sheer panic had morphed into a desperate cornered rage. He pushed his chair back and stood up, swaying slightly on his feet. "You cannot do this to me!" Sidney Terence yelled, his voice cracking with hysterical indignation. "This company is my birthright. I am the eldest son. Dad promised me this legacy since I was a little boy. You cannot just take my title and my shares and leave me with nothing. I am the chief executive officer." Marcus looked at Terence with absolute disgust. "You are a criminal, Terence," Marcus stated bluntly, not hiding his complete contempt. "You committed federal wire fraud and you lied to the board of directors. You have no birthright here anymore. You are incredibly lucky Sydney is offering a buyout instead of calling the federal authorities herself." But Terence was completely beyond reason. He could not process the reality of his own failure. His entire identity was built on the unearned privilege my parents had blindly handed to him since birth. He slammed his fist against the mahogany wood over and over again, throwing a literal temper tantrum in front of the most powerful businessmen in Atlanta. "I will not sign it," Terence screamed, sobbing hysterically into the quiet room. "I will never sign over my shares to you. You are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin my life because you could not find a husband. I will rather watch this entire company burn to the ground than ever work for you." Desmond moved toward his son, trying to calm him down, but Terence shoved him away violently. "I will not do it," Terence shrieked, stepping backward away from the table. "It is my company. It is mine." I watched his pathetic meltdown without a single ounce of sympathy. The little boy who had always gotten his way was finally facing a brick wall he could not scream his way through. I slowly reached over and snapped the golden latches on my leather briefcase closed. The sharp metallic clicks echoed clearly through the chaotic room, cutting through the noise. I picked up my briefcase by the heavy leather handle. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal suit and pushed my chair in perfectly flush with the edge of the mahogany table. The investors watched me with wide, fearful eyes as they realized exactly what I was doing. The silence rushed back into the room as everyone held their breath. "Okay," I said, my voice cutting through Terrence's hysterical sobbing like a blade of pure ice. "I gave you an opportunity to walk away with your freedom, but your arrogance is clearly more important than your survival today." I turned my back on the table and began walking toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The sharp clicking of my heels resumed their steady, unbothered rhythm against the hardwood floor. Desmond called out my name, his voice breaking into a terrified plea, but I did not stop walking or slow my pace. I paused just before reaching the exit and looked back over my shoulder directly into the red, swollen eyes of my brother. "Enjoy prison for the embezzlement, Terrence." I pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the hallway, leaving them to drown in the absolute ruin of their own making. I left the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me, but I only made it 5 steps down the carpeted hallway before the desperate and chaotic shouting inside the boardroom reached a fever pitch. Marcus was clearly not going to let his multi-million-dollar investment evaporate just because a spoiled 35-year-old man wanted to throw a pathetic temper tantrum. I stopped walking and turned around, waiting perfectly still in the quiet corridor. I listened to the muffled sounds of absolute destruction filtering through the thick glass. It took exactly 45 seconds for the boardroom doors to push open again. It was not Terrence who came running after me. It was my father. Desmond looked like a man who had just been dragged behind a moving freight truck. He stood in the doorway holding the heavy glass open with a trembling hand, while his breathing echoed ragged and uneven in the quiet hallway. He looked at me standing there in my tailored charcoal suit holding my briefcase, and for the very first time in my entire life, he did not see a tool or an inconvenience. He saw his absolute master, He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing violently against the collar of his expensive silk tie. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded my submission at the Thanksgiving dinner table was completely and permanently gone. "Sydney, please come back inside." Desmond whispered, his voice stripped of every single ounce of the booming authority he had wielded like a physical weapon for decades. "We will sign the papers, all of them. Just please do not leave us like this." I did not smile or offer him any comfort. I simply adjusted my grip on my leather briefcase and walked slowly back into the room. The atmosphere had completely shifted from chaotic rage to a heavy and suffocating funeral dirge. Marcus and the other four investors were standing behind their chairs looking down at Terence with expressions of pure predatory menace. They had clearly informed my brother that if the transfer deal was not signed immediately, they would personally call the district attorney and press federal embezzlement and wire fraud charges before lunchtime. They had laid out exactly what federal prison looked like for a soft corporate executive who stole from wealthy men. Desmond walked heavily back to his seat at the head of the table, but he did not sit down. He stood beside his large leather chair and looked down at his weeping golden child. The disappointment in his eyes was absolute. "Sign the contract, Terence," my father ordered, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any paternal warmth. "Sign the transfer documents right now and save whatever tiny piece of this family is left." Terence snapped his head up, looking at our father in absolute disbelief and betrayal. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was slick with cold sweat and tears. "You cannot make me do this." Dad, Terence sobbed loudly, wiping his running nose on the sleeve of his custom-tailored suit. "It is my company. You gave it to me. I am the chief executive officer. You promised me this was my birthright." Desmond slammed his heavy fist weakly against the mahogany table, causing the coffee cups to rattle a final time. "You do not have a company anymore," Terence Desmond replied, staring at the son who had single-handedly destroyed his life work. "You spent the operational reserves on a mountain house and designer clothes for your wife. You lied to me and you stole from these men. You let Julianne drive our biggest client away because you were too weak to control her. Sign the damn papers before they send you to a federal penitentiary and leave me completely bankrupt on the street." I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out the crisp legal transfer documents my attorney Elias had prepared. I placed them flat on the mahogany table along with a heavy black fountain pen. I slid the papers toward Terence. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely reach out to pick up the pen. He stared at the signature line where he was officially surrendering his title as Chief Executive Officer and handing over 100% of his corporate shares without a single cent of compensation. Tears dripped off his chin and splattered onto the crisp white paper, staining the legal text with salty water. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name in a jagged and messy scrawl. He pushed the papers away from him and buried his face back in his hands, weeping loudly and pathetically into the quiet room. I pulled the second set of documents from my briefcase and slid them toward Desmond. These were the relinquishment forms for his position as chairman of the board and the absolute transfer of his voting rights. My father looked down at the paperwork that effectively ended his 35-year reign over legacy logistics. He was signing away the empire he built from a single delivery truck in 1985. His hands were surprisingly steady as he picked up the pen, but his eyes were filled with a profound and heavy sorrow. He signed his name on the dotted line, officially stepping down and handing over 65% controlling ownership of the entire empire to the daughter he had spent his life ignoring and belittling. He set the pen down gently on the table as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. I picked up the signed contracts and reviewed the signatures carefully, ensuring every legal requirement was perfectly executed. I placed the documents safely inside my leather briefcase and snapped the golden latches closed. I reached into the front pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single crisp $1 bill. I had specifically gone to the bank the day before to get a brand new bill just for this exact moment. I walked around the edge of the mahogany table and placed the green paper currency directly in the center of the wood right between my father and my brother. "The transaction is officially complete," I announced, my voice carrying a quiet and terrifying authority. "I now own 65% of Legacy Logistics, and I have purchased your entire legacy for exactly $1. Marcus and the other investors let out a collective breath of relief. They immediately began packing their own briefcases, eager to leave the toxic family drama behind them now that their financial investments were officially secured by a competent leader. "I will wire the $1 million stabilization fund to the corporate accounts within the hour," I told Marcus. "You can inform the grocery executives that the routing software will be fully operational by noon and all delayed shipments will be expedited immediately." Marcus nodded respectfully, extending his hand toward me across the table. "We look forward to doing business with you, Sydney," he said, offering me the exact professional respect my family had always denied me. Once the investors cleared out of the boardroom, leaving only the three of us behind, the silence became incredibly heavy. Desmond slowly backed away from the large leather chair at the head of the table. The seat of power was completely empty. I walked deliberately toward the head of the table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a slow and victorious rhythm. I reached out and pulled the heavy leather chair back. The material was still warm from where my father had been sitting. I sat down, resting my hands gracefully on the padded armrests, and looked down the length of the massive mahogany table. My father was standing off to the side, looking like a broken shell of a man, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline he used to rule. Terrence was still sitting halfway down the table, sniffling quietly and staring at the single $1 bill resting on the wood. He had absolutely nothing left. His title was gone, his money was gone, his wife was gone, and his pride was completely shattered. I looked directly at my brother, letting a cold and unbothered smile touch my lips. "You can stay on as a junior dispatcher, Terrence," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and conversational, echoing slightly in the large glass room. "Minimum wage, no benefits, no executive washroom privileges. Do you accept?" Terrence slowly lifted his red and swollen eyes to meet my gaze. His jaw trembled as the absolute humiliation of his new reality crushed whatever tiny fragment of pride he had left inside his chest. He swallowed hard against his tears and quietly nodded. I watched Terrence gather his expensive suit jacket from the back of the mahogany chair and shuffle out of the glass boardroom like a beaten dog. He did not look back. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the executive suite for the first time, as the absolute majority owner. There was no time to sit back and celebrate because a burning building requires immediate water. I pulled my laptop from my briefcase and officially initiated the network restoration. Within 5 minutes, the Apex Data Solutions routing matrix was actively pushing live delivery schedules to the 60 commercial trucks parked at our distribution centers across the Southeast. The digital heartbeat of the supply chain was fully restored, and the massive financial bleeding was officially stopped. The financial and social cleanup over the next several weeks was absolute and highly satisfying. Once the reality of our new corporate structure settled into the reality of their personal bank accounts, the illusion of Terrence and Julianne and their perfect marriage completely disintegrated. Julianne had married a wealthy chief executive officer with an endless corporate credit card and unlimited access to the company operational reserves. She absolutely did not sign up to be the wife of a junior dispatcher making minimum wage who was currently being investigated by the Internal Revenue Service for severe financial discrepancies. I was sitting in my corner office exactly 8 weeks later when Renee brought me the morning mail and a fresh cup of coffee. She casually mentioned the latest gossip circulating the Atlanta social scene. Julianne had officially served Terrence with divorce papers. She had hired a ruthless attorney trying to claim half of the marital assets, but she quickly discovered that half of zero is still zero. Terrence was forced to pack up and move out of the massive Buckhead estate because the bank finally foreclosed on the property when he missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. He moved into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the rougher outskirts of Atlanta, driving a used sedan instead of his luxury sports car. He clocked in at the dispatch desk every morning at 6, looking miserable and completely defeated by the life he had brought upon himself. With the dead weight permanently removed from the executive payroll, I immediately set out to completely dismantle the toxic and patriarchal culture my father had spent 30 years cultivating. The very first thing I did was file the legal paperwork to officially dissolve the old corporate entity. Legacy Logistics was dead and buried. It belonged to a past that no longer served us. The massive illuminated sign on the front of the headquarters was torn down by a construction crew and replaced with a sleek and modern logo for Apex Global Logistics. I was not just taking over their empire. I was completely erasing their name from the side of the building and replacing it with my own. The cultural purge inside the corporate offices was swift and completely uncompromising. I fired every single one of the golf buddies and incompetent middle managers that Desmond and Terrence had kept on the payroll simply because they belonged to the same exclusive country clubs or fraternity networks. I cleared out the entire floor of men who had spent years talking over me in meetings, taking credit for my data analytics, and collecting massive bonuses while doing absolutely none of the actual logistical work. I had security escort them to the parking garage holding their cardboard boxes of personal belongings, ensuring they felt the exact same vulnerability they had tried to force onto me. Once the office was cleared of the systemic rot, I called a mandatory staff meeting for the remaining employees. I stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces of the people who actually kept the business running. I looked specifically at the incredible and highly capable Black women who had been systematically overlooked, underpaid, and forced to train men who were vastly less qualified than them. My father claimed to run a proud Black business, but he had spent his entire career upholding the same oppressive corporate structures that kept Black women at the bottom of the ladder, while elevating a clueless white woman like Julianne to the vice presidency. I was tearing that entire system down to the concrete foundation. I promoted Renee to the director of operations right there on the spot in front of the entire company. I doubled her salary and handed her the keys to the corner office Julianne had briefly occupied during her disastrous tenure. I elevated 3 other brilliant Black women from the warehouse management team to senior vice president roles, giving them the equity, the authority, and the respect they had earned through years of literal blood, sweat, and tears. I completely transformed the executive board from a boys' club of fragile male egos into a diverse and highly optimized team of logistical experts. The change in the operational atmosphere was instantaneous. Productivity skyrocketed because the people doing the grueling daily work were finally being recognized and compensated for their actual measurable value. 2 months into my tenure as the controlling owner, I decided to take a quiet walk through the main distribution warehouse. I stepped out of the climate-controlled administrative wing and onto the massive concrete floor of the 100,000 square foot facility that I now personally owned, free and clear. The air smelled heavily of diesel fuel and cardboard, a familiar and comforting scent that reminded me of my childhood spent watching trucks roll in and out of the loading bays. The warehouse was buzzing with intense and perfectly synchronized activity. The massive steel loading bay doors were rolled up and warm natural light flooded into the cavernous space. I walked slowly down the center aisle, dodging the heavy yellow forklifts, moving wooden pallets of high-value freight. I watched the warehouse supervisors holding digital tablets running the Apex software I had coded from scratch late at night in my apartment. The interface glowed a bright, healthy green, indicating that every single delivery window was being met with complete mathematical precision. The drivers were organized, the routes were flawless, and the profit margins were climbing higher than they ever had during my father's entire 35-year reign as chairman. I stopped near the edge of the open loading dock and looked out at the massive fleet of white delivery trucks rolling out onto the Atlanta highway, heading toward their regional destinations. Desmond had built this entire machine with his bare hands. He had suffered through the brutal racism of the 1980s corporate world to carve out a secure financial space for his family. He had built a generational empire with the explicit and stubborn intention of handing it over to his son, simply because Terrence was a man. Desmond had been willing to watch the whole thing burn to the ground, rather than admit his daughter was the only one smart enough and strong enough to save it. I had saved the legacy, but I had done it entirely on my own terms. I did not ask for a seat at their table. I bought the table, the chairs, the building, and the ground underneath it. I was pulled from my deep thoughts by the sound of deliberate footsteps approaching from behind. I turned around and saw Renee walking toward me across the concrete floor, holding a silver digital tablet against her chest. She had stepped seamlessly into her new leadership role, commanding immediate respect from every single driver and warehouse worker in the facility. Her presence was commanding and competent, everything Julianne had pretended to be. "Excuse me, Sydney," Renee said, keeping her tone perfectly professional, but offering me a small knowing smile that reached her eyes. "I know you asked not to be disturbed during your floor walk, but there is a situation upstairs in the executive waiting area that requires your immediate attention." I raised an eyebrow, wondering if Terrence had managed to mess up another basic dispatch assignment at his new minimum wage desk. "What is the problem, Renee?" I asked, folding my arms across my tailored suit jacket. "It is not a problem with the trucks or the dispatchers," Renee replied, glancing down at her silver tablet before looking back up at me. "Your father is upstairs. He bypassed the lobby security desk and refused to leave the waiting room. He is asking for a private meeting with you. He says he needs to apologize and he is begging for your forgiveness. Leadership is not granted by titles. It is proven through competence and strategic foresight. Sydney's journey teaches us never to build a foundation for those who refuse to acknowledge our worth. When contributions are ignored, stop wasting energy chasing validation. Instead, invest in cultivating your own independent assets. True leverage isn't found in a corporate promotion, but in owning the systems that others desperately depend on. Self-sufficiency is your greatest asset. Never beg for a seat at the table when you have the capacity to build your own empire. Ready to stop compromising, build your apex today, reclaim control of your career.